West African folk tales. West African folk tales. General Editor Jake Jackson. Series forward. Stretching back to the oral traditions of thousands of years ago, tales of heroes and disaster, creation and conquest have been told by many different civilizations in many different ways. Their impact sits deep within our culture, even though the detail in the tales themselves are a loose mix of historical record, transformed narrative, and the distortions of hundreds of storytellers. Today, the language of mythology lives with us. Our mood is jovial. Our countenance is saturnine. We are narcissistic, and our modern life is hermetically sealed from others. The nuances of myths and legends form part of our daily routines and help us navigate the world around us, with its half-truths and biased reported facts. The nature of a myth is that its story is already known by most of those who hear it or read it. Every generation brings a new emphasis, but the fundamentals remain the same. A desire to understand and describe the events and relationships of the world. Many of the great stories are archetypes that help us find our own place, equipping us with tools for self-understanding, both individually and as part of a broader culture. For Western societies, it is Greek mythology that speaks to us most clearly. It greatly influenced the mythological heritage of the ancient Roman civilization and is the lens through which we still see the Celts, the Norse, and many other great peoples and religions. The Greeks themselves learned much from their neighbors, the Egyptians, an older culture that became weak with age and incestuous leadership. It is important to understand that what we perceive now as mythology had its own origins in perceptions of the divine and the rituals of the sacred. The earliest civilizations in the crucible of the Middle East, in the Sumer of the 3rd millennium BC, are the source to which many of the mythic archetypes can be traced. As humankind collected together in cities for the first time, developed writing and industrial-scale agriculture, started to irrigate the rivers, and attempted to control rather than be at the mercy of its environment, humanity began to write down its tentative explanations of natural events, of floods and plagues, of disease. Early stories tell of gods, or godlike animals in the case of tribal societies such as African, Native American, or Aboriginal cultures, who are crafty and use their wits to survive. And it's reasonable to suggest that these were the first rulers of the gathering peoples of the earth, later elevated to godlike status with the distance of time. Such tales became more political as cities vied with each other for supremacy, creating new gods, new hierarchies for their pantheons. The older gods took on primordial roles and became the preserve of creation and destruction, leaving the new gods to deal with more current, everyday affairs. Empires rose and fell, with Babylon assuming the mantle from Sumeria in the 1800s BC. Then, in turn, to be swept away by the Assyrians of the 1200s BC. Then the Assyrians and the Egyptians were subjugated by the Greeks by the Romans, and so on, leading to the spread and assimilation of common themes, ideas, and stories throughout the world. The survival of history is dependent on the telling of good tales, but each one must have the feeling of truth, otherwise it will be ignored. Around the firesides, or embedded in a book or a computer, the myths and legends of the past are still the living legends of retold myth, not restricted to an exploration of origins. Now we have devices and global communications that give us unparalleled access to a diversity of traditions. We can find out about Native American, Indian, Chinese, and tribal African mythology in a new way that was denied to our ancestors. We can find connections, match the archaeology, religion, and the mythologies of the world to build a comprehensive image of the human experience that is endlessly fascinating. The stories in this book provide an introduction to the themes and concerns of the myths and legends of their respective cultures, with a short introduction to provide a linguistic, geographic, and political context. This is where the myths have arrived today, but undoubtedly, over the millennia, they will transform again, whilst retaining their essential truths and signs. Jake Jackson, General Editor. Introduction to West African Folktales. If one mythic figure exemplifies the character and spirit of West Africa more than any other, it is Anansi, the trickster spider. Quirky, mercurial, and astonishingly quick-thinking, he is always ready with a way to turn adversity into advantage, setback into success. No religion of the world has needed that ability more over the centuries than West Africa. Perhaps Anansi is irrepressibly upbeat. Not that he doesn't suffer his share of reverses. On occasion he embarrasses himself. He is by no means perfect, but he always comes back, ready for the fray. An enthusiastic storyteller himself, he is also an eager connoisseur and indefatigable collector. He longed to be the owner of all the stories known in the world, we are told at one point. Anansi appreciates that myths encode the intelligence, the wit and humor of humankind, as do the wealth of West African stories gathered here. Doubtful darkness. A sunny optimism prevails. As dismal as its history may have been at times, Africa was only ever the dark continent because Europeans chose to close their eyes. To its inhabitants, humanity in the first place, and then it followed inevitably to their achievements, the extraordinary civilizations that they had built. It was understandable that they should have found it a confusing continent, though given the immense geographic, demographic, and cultural complexity over which they were drawing their crisply clear-cut colonial map. Nowhere was this more true than in that western corner between the Sahara's southern limit and the main body of Central Africa. The first region to be visited by Europe's seaborne traders in the Age of Discovery of the 15th century, it had been opened up well before that by Arab merchants from the Maghreb, who had come down here in camel caravans across the desert sand. The mineral and agricultural wealth which had attracted these outsiders had of course already fostered the growth of an array of important indigenous cities and states. A world in one region. West Africa is indeed a little world. The map may show an orderly series of small countries clustered around a curving coast, but this view is seriously misleading. A neat-looking little segment here, Ghana is actually only the tiniest bit smaller than the United Kingdom. Nigeria is almost 4 times that the size. Moreover, these countries, with their clear-cut borders, encompass huge demographic diversity. Ghana's 100-plus indigenous ethnic communities speak some 79 languages, while Nigeria's 250-odd ethnic groups speak 500 tongues. Cameroon has 200 ethnic groups, and by some estimates up to 600 different languages. Even tiny Togo, only 57,000 kilometers squared, 22,000 square miles, in area, has 37 different recognized ethnicities. Sierra Leone lags well behind with just 16. Liberia was famously colonized in the 19th century by freed slaves from the United States, but it has 17 indigenous ethnic groups as well. Notoriously, national boundaries were laid down arbitrarily by European negotiators. So Senegal was French, as was the Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire. So too were Togo and Benin, whereas Nigeria was British, as ultimately was the Gold Coast, or Ghana. Even under colonialism, though, the real story was more complicated. Ghana had belonged to the Portuguese and the Germans before the British made it theirs. Indigenous empires. The ancient homeland of the Yoruba, who built the great civilization around life, centered on the Niger Delta, but spilled across the borders of Nigeria into modern-day Togo and Benin. Their craftsmen created bronze sculptures of breathtaking beauty. Their women worked miracles with textiles, developing sumptuous, tie-dyed indigo attire fabrics. The Yoruba believed that life, or that Ife, was the center of the world, and the place where human life had first begun. A naive parochial perspective, though no more so than the later one that saw the earth as being arranged around the Greenwich Meridian, and Ife's stunning sculptures, in virtuosity and vision a match for anything being produced in Europe at the time, as primitive. As for the rich and powerful Kingdom of Benin, which flourished between the 11th and 14th centuries, and also produced spectacular bronzes, that too was in Nigeria, a little way inland of the Delta Zone, not in the country we call Benin at all. Once again, the modern map misleads. New states rose and fell in succession, village communities coalescing into states around charismatic rulers, then slowly disintegrating as their power waned. The Ewe Kingdom of Ghana and Togo in the 16th century, the Fon Kingdom of Dahomey in the south of what is now Benin in the 17th. Windows on the world. From about 1700, the Ashanti Confederacy, a grouping of communities of the Akan people, occupied areas across southern Ghana, but also spread over into the Ivory Coast and Togo. Their wealth was originally founded in agriculture, like that of the Yoruba state, the Hausa Empire, and the Kingdom of Benin before it. They built considerable cities, but seem to have commuted out to cultivate lands outside these centers. Like other coastal communities, though, they also engaged in commerce with Europeans, first in precious resources, hence the labels Ivory Coast and Gold Coast, then subsequently in the brutal trade in slaves. Close relations with the colonial powers did not necessarily mean meek subservience. The Ashanti Confederacy resisted British settlement fiercely and scored several important victories. Cultures of quietness. Historically significant as these states were, they don't necessarily typify the trajectories of West Africa's peoples. Many lived modestly and quietly, never amassing great riches or acquiring empires. The Ekoi of southeastern Nigeria and Cameroon were experts in wood carving, creating stunningly sculpted masks. Like the Ekoi, the Fang and Bulu of Cameroon also lived peacefully for centuries. All three groups were badly hit by the depredations of the slave trade. Environmental considerations influenced the lifestyles, and hence the priorities of different peoples. To take one obvious example, communities which lived near water, like Liberia's Jabo, who lived along their country's coast, or Ghana's Karachi, who had settled in the valley of the Volta River, subsisted by fishing as well as farming. Pastoralist preferences. Further north, in the Sahel, where the tropical forests started to give way to the grassland, scrub, and semi-desert of the Saharan fringes, communities pursued a pastoralist way of life. Whilst some in the more fertile southern zone grazed flocks from the permanent villages, where they also farmed, others further north lived nomadically. They had to, given the scarcity of grazing and the unreliability of water sources. They needed to be ready to uproot at any moment and take their lives and flocks where the resources were. The most famous of these peoples were the Fula, or Fulani, herders of cattle and goats. They are believed to have originated near the coast in what is now Senegal. Over time, however, their nomadic pastoralist lifestyle took them deeper into the interior. But there were many other groups, including Akan communities living in more arid, northerly areas unsuited to the agrarian way of life their kinsfolk followed. These nomadic groups were the first to come into contact with Arab traders who over centuries came south over the Sahara to exchange salt and silks for precious metals, ivory, and other luxuries. The Arabs also brought Islam to the region. Demarcation disputes. West Africa, as a geographical or political category, is of course quite vague. Where it begins and ends is a matter of debate, with ultimately no right answer. The compiler of a collection of folk tales has to make some fairly arbitrary decisions. Not so much with regard to the region's northern frontier. The Sahara Desert is seen as setting a natural limit. Neither Mauritania nor Mali, Niger, nor Burkina Faso really look like they belong. To the southeast, the limits are a lot less clear. Geographers generally exclude countries like Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Cameroon, and the Republic of the Congo. Demographically, it is more difficult to say. For this collection, it has been decided to include Cameroon. The westernmost of this group, it shows obvious communities with the other countries we've included in its ethnic and linguistic communities. Its mythology clearly complements theirs as well. Bantu beginnings? To make an already highly complex question all but impossible to resolve, there's the fact that so much of Eastern and Southern Africa seems to have been formed, culturally and linguistically, by West Africa. If humankind as a whole came out of Africa, as most experts believe, then a great deal of Africa came out of this one little corner, albeit far, far more recently, it must be said. To this day, by far, the majority of West Africa's people speak languages belonging to the Niger-Congo group, which for many years was known to scholars as Bantu. This title is avoided now, since it is generally associated with languages and peoples found in Central and Southern Africa. The label is logical enough, though, given that the more southerly Bantu languages are believed to have been distributed through the continent by a large-scale migration which took place almost 1,000 years ago and appears to have originated in roughly this area of West Africa. But the migrants didn't just take their language with them. They took all sorts of skills, assumptions, and ideas, their beliefs and rituals, their traditions, and, surely, their myths. Though these inevitably developed and changed as new communities settled further south and east and came by new histories and new identities, they were still shaped by their remoter regions, which makes it even harder than it already was to establish a firm frontier for West Africa and a clear canon of West African folktales. a crowded cosmos. Despite these difficulties and the great diversity of the region, clear themes do emerge as we read these stories. As in just about all the world's mythologies, cosmological questions are addressed, which attempts to explain how the universe was formed, the earth, the moon, and stars, how nature was created, and how humanity came to be. It may be contradictory, but it seems consistent, somehow, given the lively and colorful character of their mythology more generally, that the Yoruba were unable to imagine an actually empty universe. Even when the waters extended all over the earth, and the world was yet to be created, it was, their creation story suggests, already peopled. Contrast this with the 7-day story of the biblical Genesis account, in which the making of man and woman is God's final task. Other West African peoples took a different view, of course, but they generally concur in depicting the newly created world as an extremely lively scene, and a strongly anthropomorphized one. The sun and moon are not just heavenly bodies, but engaging, if sometimes semi-comic, personalities. Again, the contrast with the portentous impersonality of the biblical account is strong. Animal energy. Animals are well to the fore in a great many of these stories, though they too are strongly anthropomorphized in many cases. They are fierce and frightening on occasion, naturally, but at other times more loving, helpful, kind, and of course cunning. Many of these tales of Anansi and the tortoise trickster were to have sparkling second lives as Brer Rabbit stories in the United States. To those southern plantations, this lore was carried by the first slaves. Their descendants found themselves more in need of the put-upon trickster's resourcefulness than their forebears in West Africa could ever have imagined. Perhaps, though, the latter didn't go short of challenges themselves. Flood and famine, war and violence are among the disasters featured here. Overall, though, the upbeat mood prevails. Design for living. Which takes us to another point. These stories often seem to have been designed not just to delight, but to inspire. Clever and enterprising as they are, the really important quality the tricksters have Clever and enterprising as they are, the really important quality the tricksters here represent is their indomitability, their refusal to be beaten, their readiness to reimagine an apparently impossible situation in such a way as to secure a favorable outcome. What is most deceptive about them is that they seem defeated in the first place. They are entirely honest in their determination to win out. These myths are also clearly intended to educate. A remarkable portion or a remarkable proportion of them could reasonably be classed as fables. Though seldom stern or moralistic, they nevertheless offer clear moral lessons. We could all do with a bit more of the industry and patience of the ants, the lion's courage and integrity, the rueful self-awareness of King Chameleon as represented here. Whatever our rank, we would all do well to learn the lesson of the King of Sedo. Learn the lesson the King of Sedo has to about pride. Whatever our rank, we would all do well to learn the lesson the King of Sedo has to about pride, to secure the devotion her loyal suitor, Thinker, has for the beautiful maiden Morning Sunshine. Some of these stories set out to explain how important principles of life and law came into being. We read of how the Hausa think for the first person went mad, for instance. Why it is important that a murderer should hang, however strongly we may be tempted towards mercy, and why it is ill-advised to offer help to one we know has criminal intent. Evil deeds, we find, have a way of coming back to bite us, however indirectly. A good one has a way of paying dividends. Tales and origins. Tales of origin, life, and death. An account of where we come from, how we were brought into being, is pretty much a first requirement of any mythological tradition. West Africa's are certainly no exception. Such stories do not simply suggest a first cause, important as that is, nor do they just explain creation, revealing why and how we came to have the animals, trees, and flowers, the forests and the seas, the rain, the sun, the seasons. As important, in some ways more so, they encode the cultural values of those who tell them, establish their relationship with nature and the world, and with one another, for these tales tell us just as much about the ways in which human life has traditionally been ordered in everything from social hierarchies to gender roles. All things considered, then, these stories carry quite some weight. The issues they address could hardly matter more. In tone, though, they are anything but portentous. Quirky, even comic at times, they treat the mysteries of existence with the most wry of wit, the challenges of life with droll amusement, and the final fear of death with stoic good humor. The Kingdom of the Yorubas, from the Yoruba people, southern Nigeria. The ancient king, Oduduwa, had a great many grandchildren, and on his death he divided among them all his possessions. But his youngest grandson, Oranian, was at that time away hunting, and when he returned home, he learnt that his brothers and cousins had inherited the old king's money, cattle, beads, native cloths, and crowns, but that to himself nothing was left but 21 pieces of iron, a cock, and some soil tied up in a rag. At that time, the whole earth was covered with water, on the surface of which the people lived. The resourceful Oranian spread upon the water his pieces of iron, and upon the iron he placed the scrap of cloth, and upon the cloth the soil, and on the soil the cock. The cock scratched with his feet and scattered the soil far and wide, so that the ocean was partly filled up and islands appeared everywhere. The pieces of iron became the mineral wealth hidden under the ground. Now Oranian's brothers and cousins all desired to live on the land, and Oranian allowed them to do so on payment of tribute. He thus became king of all the Yorubas, and was rich and prosperous through his grandfather's inheritance. How all stories and all history came among men. By Agra of Mbeban, of the Ekoi people, Nigeria and Cameroon. Mouse goes everywhere. Through rich men's houses she creeps, and visits even the poorest. At night, with her little bright eyes, she watches the doing of secret things, and no treasure chamber is so safe but she can tunnel through and see what is hidden there. In old days, she wove a story child from all that she saw, and to each of these she gave a gown of different colors, white, red, blue, or black. The stories became her children, and lived in her house and served her, because she had no children of her own. Now, in olden days, a sheep and a leopard lived in the same town. In course of time, leopard became anciente, and sheep also. Sheep bore a daughter, and leopard a son. You know, I'm gonna have to hold on for this minute. I don't know what that. I don't think I've ever seen that word before. Enceinte. I wonder even how it's pronounced. Let's see. Let's take a pause here while Hakeem figures out what this word is that apparently I've never seen before. Let's spell it out, Googles. Enceinte. Google, you are stupid as hell. Alright, hold on. What's going on here? I gotta put it in by hand. Enceinte. Yeah, I know. I totally broke. Ncei. Oh, there we go. The meaning. Oh, pregnant. Oh, God. Why would they use that word? Enceinte is a French term that refers to the main defensive enclosure of a fortification. For a castle, that this is the main defensive wall. Okay. Apparently. Of course, it has different meanings. An enclosure in an area of land. So it's either pregnant or an enclosure. That's the two I'm going to go with. All right. And since I broke out for a moment, I'm going to start that section again, but just I'm going to say hello to whoever came into wisdom here. Hello, Yusuf Wasserman, Migdalia, Foxy, Lois Hampson, Matthew Burris, Angelina Frost, Marcy Ann, Mojo, Christopher John Martins, Cosmic J, Mike Jackson, Dottie, hello Dottie, and Rebecca Oberotha, and Anthony Thomas. All right, so I'm going to continue here with this story that is called How All Stories and All History Came Among Men by Agra of Mbeban of the Ekwa people, Nigeria and Cameroon. I'm starting from the beginning. Mouse goes everywhere. Through rich men's houses she creeps, and visits even the poorest. At night, with her little bright eyes, she watches the doing of secret things, and no treasure chamber is so safe but she can tunnel through and see what is hidden there. In old days, she wove a story child from all that she saw, and to each of these she gave a gown of different colors, white, red, blue, or black. The stories became her children, and lived in her house and served her, because she had no children of her own. Now, in olden days, a sheep and a leopard lived in the same town. In course of time, leopard became enceinte, and sheep also. Sheep bore a daughter, and leopard a son. There was a famine in all the land. So leopard went to sheep and said, "Let us kill our children and eat them." Sheep thought, "If I do not agree, she may kill my child in spite of me." So she answered, "Good." Then sheep went and hid her own babe, and took all that she had and sold for a little dried meat. This she cooked and set before leopard, and they both ate together. Leopard killed her own child, and ate that also. In another year, they both became enceinte again, or once more. This time again the townsfolk were hungry. Leopard came as before and said, "Let us kill these children also." Sheep agreed. But she took her second child and hid her in the little room where the first child was, then went out and begged till someone gave her a few pieces of dried meat. These she cooked and set before leopard as she had done before, in place of her babe. Leopard ate and said nothing. Some years afterward, leopard sent to sheep and said, "Come, today you shall feast with me." Sheep went, and found a great calabash on the table. She opened it, and found it full of food, and by it 3 spoons laid ready. She was astonished, and questioned Leopard, "Formerly we used 2 spoons, you and I. Why should there be 3 today?" Leopard laughed, opened the door of the inner room, and called, "Come, daughter, let us eat." Her daughter came, and they all ate together. Then the mother said, "When my first child came, I killed and ate him, because we were very hungry. But when I learned how you had saved your child, I thought, next time I also will play such a trick on sheep. Therefore I saved my daughter alive." After that, Sheep went home and tended her 2 children. Years passed by, and all the daughters began to grow up. Leopard put her child into the fatting house. Then she went to Sheep and said, "Give me one of your daughters to stay with mine in the fatting house. She is alone and cannot eat." Now Sheep and both her daughters were quite black, but there were some young goats in the house which served them as slaves. These were white. So before Sheep sent her daughter to Leopard's house, she rubbed her all over with white chalk, then dyed one of the young goats black, and sent them together. When they both arrived at the house, Leopard thought that the goat was Sheep's daughter. All 3 of the young ones were placed in the fatting house. During the night, Leopard entered the room, took goat, and killed her, then cooked the meal and gave to her own daughter to eat, thinking it was the daughter of Sheep whom she had slain. Next day, Leopard went to Sheep and said, "Give me your other child, that our 3 daughters may be in the fatting house together." Sheep consented, but before this child went, she advised her what to do. When, therefore, the second lamb reached the fatting house, she took out a bottle of rum and gave it to Leopard's daughter, saying, "Drink this. It is a present which my mother has sent you." So Leopard's child drank and fell asleep. The 2 young sheep kept awake until their companions slept. They then got up, carried her from her own bed, and laid her on one of those prepared for themselves. It was very dark in the room, and when Leopard came in to kill one of the young sheep, she killed her own daughter instead. She was pleased and thought, "Now I have finished with the children whom Sheep hid from me." Next morning, very early, she went out to the bush to get palm wine, that she might drink it with her daughter while they feasted on the young sheep. No sooner had she left the house than the 2 sheep ran out. One of them went home to her mother's house, but the other followed after Leopard. The latter was at the top of a high palm tree, so Sheep's child stopped some way off and called in a loud voice, "Last night you tried to kill me as you did the young goat, but you made a mistake and killed your own child instead." No sooner had Leopard heard this than she jumped from the tree and ran after the young sheep. The latter ran into the crossroads, and when Leopard reached the place, she could not tell which way Sheep had gone. After thinking a while, she took the wrong road and ran on. Now, when Sheep had run a long way, she met the Nim woman walking along with her juju round her waist. The woman looked as if she had come a long way, and Sheep said, "Let me carry your juju for you." To this the Nim woman agreed. When they came to her house, she was very tired, and her head hurt her. Sheep said, "Let me fetch water and firewood while you rest." The Nim woman was very thankful, and went into her house to lie down. When the young sheep had done as she promised, she went into the other part of the house where the Nim shrine was. On it she saw the medicine. She took this and rubbed over herself. The next day, the Nim woman said, "Will you go and fetch me my medicine, which stands on the shrine of Nim?" Sheep asked her, "Do you not know that I was born into your medicine last night?" At this, the Nim woman was very angry and sprang up. Sheep ran, and the Nim woman followed her. In her hurry to escape, Sheep ran against the door of the house where Mouse lived. The door was old, and it broke, and all the stories on earth and all the histories ran out. After that, they never went back to dwell with Mouse anymore, but remained running up and down over all the earth. Interesting. All right, well, that is the first of one of the stories from this West African folktales book here. Wow. And there's a lot of short ones and a few longer ones. Very, very interesting. The next one is The Gods Descend from the Sky from the Fawn People of Benin. Then you have God Abandons the Earth from Ghana. And then The Coming of Darkness from the Kono people in Sierra Leone. And then Why the Moon and Stars Receive Their Light from the Sun. How the Moon First Came into the Sky. That one looks like that's a long one. Well, longer than others. How All the Stars Came. How the two biggest stars came into the sky. How the sun came into the sky. Wow, this is really cool. All right. Well, you've been listening to World Reading Club presented by Hakeem Ali-Bokus Alexander here on Spreaker Social Podcasting and Wisdom Social Audio Inc. presented for World Reading Club in association with UniquilibriuM. This edition's reading focus has come to us from West African Folktales, with the general editor being Jake Jackson. This is about myths, legends, folktales, and stories from around the world. The rich folklore of West Africa reaches beyond its boundaries, inside and outside the continent. Many stories have migrated across the Atlantic with the historic slave trade. Iconic characters such as Anansi and the tortoise, the cunning trickster animals, play an important role in moral lessons that also entertain, while the origins of life are explained through tales of gods such as Nana Baluku, the mother of all creation. From the Wolof and the Kono to the Hausa and the Yoruba, from Senegal via Sierra Leone, Liberia and the Ivory Coast to Ghana and Nigeria especially, these tales teach humans to live, love, survive, and thrive. All right, y'all. I'll be back. Until next time, stay well.